Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Fridays with Vistage webinar. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. When you join today's webinar, you selected to join either by phone call or computer audio. If for any reason you would like to change your selection, you can do so by accessing your audio pane in your control panel. During the presentation, all participants will be in listen-only mode. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session. Please note that a PDF of today's presentation is available for download on your control panel. A recording of this presentation will be sent to attendees via email within a week. I would now like to introduce the moderator for today's webinar, Ann Petrick, Director of Research for Vistage. Ann?
Thank you. At Vistage, we regularly survey CEOs about prospects for their business, sentiment on the economy, and expansion plans, capturing trends in these indicators over time. And our most recent CEO Confidence Index survey, conducted at the end of last year, found that despite diminishing optimism for the economy, nearly 2/3 of CEOs, 65% to be exact, plan to expand their workforce in the next 12 months. That same survey also captured that employee development is one of the top tactics small and mid-sized businesses are using to address their hiring challenges, with 70% of CEOs saying this is a tactic they use over things like boosting wages or adding benefits. So really the impact of investing in existing employees is twofold. First, it provides the ability to create a pipeline of talent from within. And second, it drives retention and deepens engagement, which is critical in a competitive job market. So if you're interested in boosting employee engagement and profitable growth, today's session gives us the opportunity to learn about companies who excel at both. Industry leaders like Southwest Airlines, Capital One, and BHP Billiton empower employees to think and act like owners, driving profitable growth. These companies bring the economics of their business alive for their people. They use a framework to help employees understand key metrics that drive profitability and empower them to develop ideas about how to move those numbers. They enable employees to participate in the wealth creation of the business, just as the owners do. This is something all businesses can do, regardless of their size. Today's speaker, Bill Fotsch, founder of Open Book Coaching, will explain that framework and show how CEOs of small and mid-sized businesses can apply the same principles. Learn the processes and tools to help your organization, as well as missteps to avoid. As founder of Open Book Coaching, Bill works with companies that are improving business results and the lives of their employees through open book management. With more than 20 years experience as a business coach, he's helped nearly 400 companies bring the economics of the business alive for their people. His client list includes the large companies already mentioned, as well as numerous small and mid-sized businesses. Bill, welcome, and I'll turn this over to you.
Great stuff. Thanks, Ann, and welcome to all of our guests. I want to tell you, this notion of engaging employees is certainly something that's topical for most folks. I'm guessing most everybody on the call or webinar today. I'd like to start by a question, and I'd like to reinforce that notion of questions with all of you. So as we proceed, if you have any questions, please, as Ann suggested, fire those in, because we're going to allow a fair amount of time for questions asked and answers at the end of this presentation. I'd like to start by a question. You see two companies here. They're identical. They have the same products and services. They serve the same markets. They draw from the same area for our employees. The only difference between these two companies is on the company on the left, employees, it's just a job. I'm not saying good or bad, but I'm saying they come to work like most employees come to work. It's just a job. The company on the right, they think and act like owners. They're economically engaged in that company. And the thing I'd like you to think about is, what do you think is the implications for customers, for employees, for management, even for the community, and maybe especially, how'd you like to compete with a company where the employees are all thinking and acting like owners? The premise here, frankly, is pretty straightforward. It's kind of like, duh, of course you'd want to invest in a company that more thought and acted like owners. Unfortunately, it's pretty clear that most companies don't. So, and I do that by segueing over to how we've been doing on engagement. Probably the leading individual or company that has been tracking engagement has been Gallup. They've been doing that for about 20 years. 20 years ago, they recorded employee engagement at a pretty horrible 30%. Today, it's up to a whopping big 34%. And you've probably seen various and sundry suggestions at how to improve engagement: better benefits, office furniture, volunteer work, flexible hours, ping pong, team building. They're all well intended, but frankly, they don't tend to be effective or sustainable. A little note: when you see in the presentation right now that blue, need to learn from the past, there's a hot link to a recent Forbes article that we've done, and there's various references throughout this presentation. What I mean by we need to learn from the past is, frankly, if you go back 100 years ago, engagement was not a problem. Most employees were part of a small, typically family business or farm, and the notion of how they were doing and how their lifestyle was affected by that was, I mean, it was just like common knowledge. We've just forgotten that. It's kind of left as we went into the Industrial Revolution. And frankly, it's even worse than that. I came across this depressing employee engagement statistics that shows for most employees, the most engaged they are is the first day at work. And then they fall off from that. And it's not that anybody intends that, but in general, engagement just isn't working with most companies. So I think the natural question is, well, are there some success stories? Are there some examples of companies that really have been doing quite well? Because an advantage, if you will, is if everybody's really lousy at this and you can be pretty good, the difference between you and the competition is going to be dramatic. Here are some examples, and we pulled out of the roughly 400 folks that we've worked with. I started with Southwest Airlines, had the privilege of working with them. I'll show you a little slide off of that. I've starred Boardman, which is a fabricator, a manufacturer. We're going to go through a case study with them. Carlson Travel, a company many of you may be familiar with that has multiple branches. I'll give you a little vignette on how they did. Gourmet Events Hawaii, another service company. Furborn Engineering, we're going to go through a case study there. There are a collection of examples. BHP Billiton, by the way, is in Australia, really big mining company there. There are a variety of emerging success stories, and their results are frankly pretty impressive. I'll show you, for instance, Mike Vandeven. At this stage, he was they called at Southwest Airlines, they called this initiative Plain Smart Business. You see that on the slide. Some of the stuff that they were sharing was a little confidential, so we kind of made the slide just a little bit fuzzy. But he was sharing economics, discussing economics with their pilots. Those are the folks in the audience. And frankly, their pilots were also sharing with him the economics of how they could affect things as a pilot. So there was learning going on in both directions. By the way, Mike is now the chief operating officer at Southwest Airlines. At Carlson Travel, they had 27 branches. They decided to select 3 of those branches to try this notion of getting people economically engaged, thinking and acting like owners. Those 3 branches, Rochester, St. Louis, and Houston, exceeded budget by 10 to 20% each. None of the other branches hit budget. So it was stark difference between those, and it was a real good sort of experiment and control. Needless to say, they rolled this out with all of the various branches, but just that first year, they ended up generating $1.7 million in incremental profit, not to mention the job security and incremental engagement that flowed from that. Janet Wheatley, you can look into the YouTube video that they did, if you click through on that one, I mean, her comments speak for themselves. The results are nothing short of incredible. This is a Forbes article of the company that we worked with in Hawaii, the thing I wanted to mention here is not only can you engage your employees, but because at least at this stage it's relatively novel, it's newsworthy. We help them write a Forbes article, and now when they send out their emails, you can see on the bottom, right over here, featured in Forbes as part of everybody's emails out. So it's another way of distinguishing themselves. So kind of a great branding opportunity. Another example of this, which I think was really pretty novel, was this was a design build company. Anthony Wilder Design Build. Had the privilege of starting work with them in 2006. You can see they had a dramatic boost in 2007. Now I want to ask you, what do you think it was like to be in the design build business? They happen to be located in the greater Washington, D.C., Baltimore area. What do you think that was like when the financial crisis hit? I mean, there were a lot of remodelers that went bankrupt. Not Anthony Wilder Design Build. They laid off no one and weathered the storm and came out of that much stronger. So this not only works well in good times, but it also works well in bad times. If you're interested in more there, the hot link to a MSNBC video may be of interest. We did a survey of 140 CEOs of credit unions. And here what we did is sorted those that were sort of low on the notion of employee engagement or economic ownership, excuse me, versus those that were relatively high. Look at these differences. I mean, return on assets, profitability, 50% higher in the higher group. Asset growth, which is the way they tend to measure growth, 6 times faster. And delinquent loans, which you could think of as a risk measure, considerably lower. So there's some fairly significant research about the delta and the impact that ownership makes. And frankly, I wouldn't call any of those credit unions in the high area exemplary. They're just starting to get going. Last is, this is a construction firm. I just pointing out here, we measure particular parameters. You see on the left, the goal clarity, goal communication, fair bonus, trust and management. You can see each of the year and how that's built. And I put right next to it, sales, gross margin, and profits. And you can pretty much see the link between those things. And frankly, from our standpoint, because our compensation is tied directly to the results of the clients we work with, we make money when they make money, and as a result, we have a very pragmatic view about all of this kind of stuff. So with that as just some examples, I wanted to give you what I think are the key economic drivers. I start with clarity on what defines success. We find very often, even in really good companies, this was true at Southwest, that having a very clear definition of success isn't necessarily known. And if you're not really clear on what winning means, the likelihood you're going to be able to rally all the troops is pretty low. The next is understanding the business economics, what in effect are the drivers of that winning. Transparency on an ongoing basis so we can see when we're winning, when we're losing, and why, and learn from that. As it relates to the compensation side, I think our academic advisor, he's a Harvard Business School professor by the name of Dennis Campbell, put it well when you just want to be fair, meaning if we're managing to generate incremental results, that's the basis on which you can fund some amount of compensation, in effect have the employees share some of that. And then there's this notion of ongoing learning. We're kind of getting away, by the way, from the phrase open book management. So I kind of put as maybe a little bit of a joke, a spoiler alert, you don't start by opening the books and sharing income statements and balance sheets. That we have found is not a road to success. An implementation timetable is laid out here. It's more of a reference than anything else, although you can see input from the employees, input from the management, input from the customers, and I'm going to highlight that just in a second, financial analysis. This is where we're trying to understand what the real issues are and distill from that what winning means. Then the scoreboard, the incentive plan, the weekly huddles sort of flow from that. I could talk off this slide, but I think it's better to go through the two case examples that I've got for you. So let me do that. The first one, this is a manufacturing firm, happens to be located in Oklahoma. Background, Roger Grommet, the CEO, and CFO, Jim Hageman, were partners, good guys, a little bit top down, maybe just a little bit paternalistic. They make large pressure vessels. That's what they do. They wanted the company to go to a next level, which that, by the way, that is kind of a common thread with most of the folks we work with. And the idea of more effectively engaging employees was something I'm really interested in doing. They heard me speak, so they got in touch. The first thing we did was input from the employees, that diagnostic thing that I was telling you about earlier. By the way, a little note, and I've put a number by the 5 different things that you can execute on immediately. And that is getting employee input. But it's not, are you feeling good and that kind of stuff. Those are fine questions. But I think the owner questions are much better when you ask a question like, what's the biggest opportunity for improvement the company should pursue? How should the company improve customer relationships and consequently sales? If you want folks to think and act like owners, it's real smart to give them owner kind of questions, get them thinking in those terms. Similar kinds of questions for the management, getting customer input. I'll show you the script that we tend to use, financial trend analysis, existing management reports. This is the diagnostic framework that then feeds into the subsequent steps. I'm going to highlight this, by the way, and this is the second thing you can execute on immediately. And that is this customer input script. If you're familiar with Fred Reicheld's work and the Net Promoter Score, you'll recognize the, given the work you've done in the past, would you be willing to enthusiastically refer us to a friend or colleague? Although we've simplified that instead of 1 to 10 to just yes, no. The follow-on question of why, you can see, again, there's a hot link to a Forbes article that provides a little more background on this. You follow this script. And by the way, on the end, you see, are you familiar with our whatever the, if you have a newer product or service, highlight that in their particular case, 4-inch welding, cylinder welding is relatively rare. I'm sure many of you find that fascinating. In any event, the upshot is this relatively quick interview script can give you great information from your marketplace. And the darndest thing that is going to happen is when you have these kinds of conversations with your customers, I'm telling you, repeat and referral business is going to increase. It happens every time. With that being the case, I'm taking you now into the specifics of the working session we had with Boardman. We had done that diagnostic work. We were working with 9 of their senior management. We'd gone through all that information. We asked them for what were the number 1 and number 2 issues that they felt the company faced in the next year. We sort of distilled that down to these 6: shipments, job cost, job efficiency, shipment forecasting, on-time delivery, manpower efficiency. So I said, what would be a metric? What would reflect winning given those issues? What they came up with was job margin dollars by month. So it's really pretty simple. Every time they ship a job, it's the revenue on the job minus the direct labor and the direct material. If job margin dollars per month are going up, their overheads don't change a heck of a lot. The likelihood that they're winning, very high. That then got into a scoreboard where you can see in this dark blue line, that was the prior year. They set what I think is, anybody would agree, was a really aggressive budget for the following year. And then it's a little hard to see, but I want to highlight that light blue line. That light blue line represents where they're starting to forecast. This slide, or this graph, was from January 7th, but they're already forecasting out through March. So they got a good idea of where they're going. That links right to their incentive plan. Because their incentive plan, you can see this blue line at budget. If they hit budget, 7.8 million in job margin, everybody would get 80 hours or 2 weeks of pay. And frankly, I would get 12,000 bucks. And everybody knows this, okay? But in the first quarter, they'd get 8 hours of pay, but it's a sliding scale. Right now, they're forecasting there's 2.1 million. So it's 2.1 million. That means in the first quarter, they would get 20 hours of pay. Everybody sees that. That gets updated every week. Now, we actually shared exactly this slide with all of the employees and then asked them the following pretty simple question. What can you do? What can you individually do to drive job margins and consequently the bonus? I highlight that as number 3 is if you've got winning well defined in your company, I would strongly encourage you to ask a similar kind of question for your folks. We took all the answers and in effect put them into categories of labor, material, speed. These are the number of mentions. I'll take quality as an example because we created this sort of crafted, you might call it a business literacy sort of program. So as an example with quality, we said, well, what does quality mean? They said the elimination of rework. I said, great. So what's our current level of rework? They said about 5 or 6%. I said, okay. So if we reduce that, what effect would that have on labor costs? They said, well, it'll reduce it. I said, great. By about how much? I said, well, probably about 5%. Got it. Okay. If we got rid of all that rework, what would happen to our material costs? One guy says, well, you know, the welding rods for sure, we do less of that. And God forbid, if we nick a valve, boy, it gets real expensive real fast. I said, yeah, great. But okay, I mean, nominally, how much do you think we'd be able to save? They said, oh, easy, 2%. I said, great. So our material cost went from 56,000 to 55. Oops. As a result, our margin, instead of 34,000, our margin ends up being 36,000. I asked them, would their revenue change? And they said, well, no, but we've got a pretty strong backlog. If we weren't doing the rework, then we'd be able to get another job out. So instead of 23 jobs, be 24 jobs. 24 jobs times 36,000 in job margin is 880,000 versus the base case of 800,000. Quality is worth $80,000 a month. We summed all that up. It was 360,000 a month, or just over 4 million a year. So I asked them, what if we realized just half of that? Do you think we could realize half of that in the coming year? And they said, yeah, we sure should be able to do that. I said, well, that'd be make quite a difference, because instead of 7.8 million and you getting 2 weeks of pay, it'd be 9.8 million and you guys would get 3 months of pay. And oh, by the way, I'd get paid a lot more too. They got pretty fired up about that. And I assure you, this is wildly self-funded. The vast majority of the cash stays in the company. Well, the upshot is every week we're going through this. Every week we're updating the forecast. Every week we're learning. But you can see for yourself, they by and large hit it. Sum it up, profits generated were more than 3 times the last 3 years combined. The management team and the employees are now really aligned and driving for further success. The culture has changed from a paternalistic kind of top-down, do what you're told, to an opportunity really for everyone. And I was struck by Roger's comment. Roger is a really good guy, but he's kind of a my way or the highway guy. And when he told me, Bill, I no longer have employees. I have entrepreneurs who are continually looking for ways to make more money. I suspect most folks would like that, and Boardman is becoming a very formidable competitor. Now, that's in a manufacturing setting. Let's go to an engineering setting. This is a service company. Richard Furborn and Jeff Andrews were the partners. They had a relatively small engineering firm. It happens to be based in Utah. They got started. I won't take you through the same old process, but for them, the winning became revenue per hour, and they really got after that, and they were really moving it in the right direction. Then it hit. They had two customers that made up about 50% of their revenues, and both of them in November reduced their demand for engineering services by more than half. It just killed them. So we're saying, like, what are we going to do? Part of what emerged was, wait a minute, we've got unutilized staff. We can really redouble our efforts at reaching out to customers and consequently generating more repeat and referral work. That's what they did. This is the group. That's the script they used. In their particular case, they have a relatively unique scanning technology that was kind of the optional feature that they focused on. The result was, in the first 9 calls, they got 8 referrals. Now, frankly, it takes a while to get this done. So it was a while before they really recovered from that big drop in revenue. And the other thing they did that I think was really smart was they looked at the relative profitability of the work that they had done, and they came to see that the industrial manufacturer clients and the contractor clients tended to be higher margins and higher volumes. So guess what? That's where they're focusing. This type of analysis, again, I'm suggesting that's what the 4 is about, is something that you can do too. And if you do it, I'd encourage having members of your team pull that information together. In any event, the result was year on year, sales were up from the low end in January to the following year. They were up 300%. Now, some of that is because they got crushed so much. But the bottom line is they really started moving it. And today, they're at 3.25 million, 25% over where they were in 2014. So it's really continuing. Every week, frankly, with all of our clients, I sit in on a virtual weekly meeting where we go through, where are we at? What's working, what's not? In their particular case, customer by customer. And it's a little bit fogged over because, frankly, there's some of this that's a little bit confidential, but it's that ongoing learning, attention to detail, seeing where we're at. That's really what lights this stuff up. The other thing that was noteworthy, I think at least, at Furborn is it used to be Richard and Jeff. These are the guys up top. They were responsible for all of the outstanding proposals and whatever was current. You can see now the number of individuals that are driving business. So the company is much more diversified, not only in clients, but also in capability. We've got a lot more folks with their oar in the water in generating business. With that being the case, customer interviews led to closer relationships with customers, leading to more repeat business. Customer referrals led to new customers, diversifying the business more and further growing revenue. More individual bring on work. I didn't mention in here, but I'll bring something up that was pretty interesting. A relatively small competitor in the same market ended up closing its doors. And Richard recognized there was a lot of talent there. He didn't acquire the engineering firm, he just acquired all the talent. And these guys came into the Furborn environment and they were like little kids in candy stores. I mean, they couldn't believe the transparency and the connectedness. And frankly, they're driving some very considerable profits and some very considerable bonuses, which they should be. So I'm hoping we're going to have some questions out there. I've got just a few closing observations or comments. And that is, one, probably my favorite quote from a US president from Abraham Lincoln is, if you look for the good in men, you will find it. So too if you look for the evil. I can tell you, I'm an engineer by background, so I'm really process oriented, and I'm really, I tend to be a problem solver, like a lot of folks. So I look for problems. Sometimes what you got to look for is successes. So if you're spending time looking for where are folks doing something right and then applauding, that's going to tend to serve you well. Kind of a lesson that I learned there. And it fits with the whole thinking and acting like owners. The other thing I was going to tell you is this is real personal, ladies and gentlemen. This happens to be a construction guy in Australia at BHP. And I really remember Wayne when he said, Bill, understand the economics that's really got the best of me. I mean, I see what I'm doing. I see how I'm making a difference. I see how, given that, we're making more money and I'm making more money as a result. This is not the kind of thing that you typically hear from a guy like Wayne. But now you hear it from Wayne. And it's not just Wayne. It's George, the Southwest Airlines Orlando senior pilot. It's Jose, the Boardman lead weller. It's Susan, the Option 1 infusion specialist. It's Jeremy, the Furborn senior engineer, who's now a partner. It's George, the 1 week bath project manager. In that particular case, it's a coaching company that I'm now a 1/3 investor in. It's Pius in ZCCM, which was actually in Africa, a concentrator mechanic. The notion of giving people a view of how they really make a difference, treating them like adults, like real partners in the business, it changes them. And it changes your relationship with them, which is why I put the phrase, what about your employees? With that, the close is, yeah, we're kind of in the dark ages right now. I actually did a little bit of research and I came up with this picture of what it was to be a serf in the dark ages. Pretty lousy. And I got another picture of what the Renaissance was like, or the Age of Enlightenment. And I'd say, ladies and gentlemen, this is the current day version of the Age of Enlightenment. So it's like more fun and more making money. With that, I'm going to quickly recap the 5 things that you can apply immediately. Ask your employees specifically on how can your company improve. I'm a huge fan of the customer interviews. And in fact, you might, if you're thinking about sequence, you might do that first. Because, I mean, it kind of all starts with your customers and really understanding value from their perspective. But inevitably, that's going to generate increased repeat and referral revenue. Getting individual ideas from all of your employees once you've really clearly defined what winning means. The profitability analysis, just so you know you're targeted on the right kinds of things, and really looking for the good in your team and applauding when you see it. So those are those things I think you can apply immediately. I don't have a watch with me. How are we doing on time, and do we have any questions?
We're doing great, Bill. Thank you. And we do have quite a few questions, so I'm glad we have some good time to address those. So going back a few slides, I love the idea of going from it's a job to really feeling like part of the. So one of the questions was, how do you define engagement? And to me, this is a really good way to define engagement. So is there anything that you might add in terms of like defining employee engagement?
Yeah, Doug, put it this way. And by the way, I think that's a great question. If you think of your employees as business partners, because I'm not going to talk about engagement in the same terms a lot of people do. I'm going to talk about it in very economic terms, like adult contractual kind of relationships. If you can speak with your employees and they can tell you what winning means, what the economics of the company really are, and how they can affect it. When I'll take as an example, when I was at Southwest, and I'm an investor, and I love Southwest. I think they're a great company. But they've got a great culture. But when we were talking with the pilots about how they can drive the economics, and Mike said, "Well, Bill, pilot productivity, that's basically all they can do. They fly from point A to point B. It's just they got to be more productive." So I said, "Well, great, but let's hear from the pilots, because neither you nor I are pilots." And the pilots came back, that was part of our survey, and said it really is pilot productivity and fuel economy. And we started talking about exactly how they could affect fuel economy. Well, the point I'm making is, when you're having those kinds of conversations with your employees, I'd almost turn around and say, are you and they engaged? And the answer is kind of course, yes. If they, so I think that the notion of very tangible, how can they understand the economics of the business and drive it? And if they can understand the economics of the business and they're driving it, and there's an answer to the question, what's in it from them, I think the likelihood that you're going to have an engagement problem is very low.
Excellent. So that sounds like a lot of like qualitative conversations with employees to understand, their level of understanding of the business. So are there other ways that you might measure that?
Yeah, it's well, and it would almost take another webinar to get into it, but here, let me go back a little bit. Here we go. Behind this graph at Boardman is a weekly forecasting that is a roll up, for that matter, Furborn's the same thing, is a roll up. And the reason I raised that is, you can see whether people understand the economics when they're forecasting what's going to happen, and the actuals prove them right. So one of the things you note here is this light blue line, it's really hard to see, is forecast, and the actual is kind of on top of it. These guys are right on top of it, and that's a build up. There's 20 some odd different voices that are building that forecast, because it's each of the various individual jobs. So the point that I'm making, if that particular individual is interested, there's a Forbes article we wrote on the power of forecasting. The way you can really understand the economics well is by forecasting what's going to happen, have that be an ongoing thing, and then when the actuals come in, it's sort of like the papers get graded, and there's the ongoing learning that stems from that.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. And so this is the Boardman example, and we had a question about what is the best compensation structure for achieving the economic engagement. And in this example, they were paid out a certain number of hours, but is there a best model for that kind of compensation?
A couple of things. One, I would say that most businesses are team sports. So, and most of the financials are affected by the team results. So I'm pretty big fan, as was the case here, I'm pretty big fan of the team-based compensation schemes. So that one. Two, if all the compensation is wages and there's no performance comp, then there's no link to the company's results. So I'm a pretty big fan of, like Southwest has done for years, they do it in terms of profit sharing. Now, one of the things that I found, it's a stupid simple thing, but how you present this makes a difference. Meaning, if you tell someone that they're going to get 80 hours of pay, or nominally 3% of pay, that's what that number equals. They say, well, that doesn't sound like very much. If you say they're going to get 2 weeks of pay, they go, like, 2 weeks of pay? You want to speak in ways that mean something to them. That's why there was a time that the bonus was expressed in terms of percent of pay. We just found it meant more to people to talk in terms of paid hours or days of pay in another setting. So those tend to be good things to do. The other thing implicit in that is if you are forecasting the results, therefore you're forecasting what the next bonus is going to be, it brings the bonus to life. It's not, it's the end of the quarter or the end of the year, and now it's 6 weeks later when we find out what did we get. It's the second week of the quarter, and we're already talking about what the next quarterly bonus is going to be. And we can see that forecast. It really brings that alive. So the notion of that visibility of the incentive plan, I think, is really important.
Yeah, that leads to another question we have is how can you keep score if you don't share the financials early and focus on the education?
Great. I love this question. Did you notice in none of the examples that I talk about an income statement or balance sheet? None of them. Not at Furborn, not at Southwest, not at Boardman. We're getting at things that drive winning. If you drive, let's stay with Boardman for the moment, if you drive job margin per month, you will absolutely drive the financials. But you don't have to get into all the nooks and crannies of understanding the income statement. Mm-hmm. So, and part of what's kind of slick about that is you go to any of the welders on the floor and you ask them what an income statement, what the income statement is. I mean, they're scratching their heads. You ask them about what can they do to improve job margin per month. You're speaking their language. They're talking to you now. They're talking about rework or efficiency or what we can do in pricing. So the upshot is that I think one of the things that is an unfortunate result, my editor, John Case, is literally the guy who coined the phrase open book management, wrote 2 books, in my estimation, the best writer on the subject. But it's an incredibly lousy title. That's what I meant with the spoiler alert. Don't start by opening the books. You may progress over time to the point that you're really talking about, income statements and balance sheets, but that's a ways down the road. You want to make sure folks start on stuff that really resonates with them and makes sense and, in fact, drives the results of the business. And that is rarely a focus on income statements or balance sheets.
Yeah, so I had a question about that. It seems like with these case studies you shared that the success was really based on nailing that metric of what is the thing that drives the business. How hard is that to get to? How much time does that take?
Well, 400 times, you get faster at it. But the other thing that's true is it's not only, it's a really insightful question. Let me go back there and I'll do the Boardman thing because these were the inputs. How you get there makes a difference. This actually came up when I was speaking with Mike Vandeven, and he said, it's the winning metric is pilot productivity. And I said, Mike, maybe it is, but if you tell a group of Southwest pilots that it's pilot productivity versus them telling you it's pilot productivity, we're going to be a very different place. He agreed. That's when we ended up doing the survey. That's when we learned both pilot productivity and fuel economy. So what I'm saying is how you get there makes a difference. What part of the deal is if you get input from the employees, from the management, from your customers, really important, the financial trend analysis and your existing management reports, you're looking at the company from a whole variety of different perspectives. The likelihood that you're going to surface the key issues, just like we did in this exercise, and then distill down to what metric makes sense. And the other thing that I probably was not clear about is we find this to be an annual exercise because the circumstances in companies change. So don't think about it as the winning metric for all time. Just for the next, typically year, focus on that. And then let's see where we get to. Let's see what the next set of issues are and where we go from there. Did that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. Yeah, start simple. So how long does this take then to implement? So to that first process where you walk through the employee interviews, the manager interviews, how much time does that take, and how much time from when you start that to when you can actually start implementing economic engagement? What kind of ramp time is that?
First, I'm going to say I love this crowd. I love these questions. I mean, seriously, I love these questions. I'm going to go to the timetable. By the way, because our compensation is tied to improving the results, we're always looking to improve that. And I can tell you with a client that I'm just working with for the first time in January, we're redefining it. What I mean by that is there's typically this diagnostic front end, okay, that we've talked about, looked at in a couple of different ways. But and then from there, figure out what the metric is that defines winning. And usually you can get that done. This is in the design phase. You can get that done comfortably in a month. What's really cool with this happens to be we're getting a number of credit union clients because of the results of that research that we helped create. We found that the reaching out to customers that we did in the diagnostic phase, they got really fired up about it and said, we should be doing this like a lot more right now. So we haven't even defined winning yet. And they're already reaching out. I shouldn't say that. We've more or less defined winning as revenue per employee. That's kind of what they're going after. But it's not a tight thing. The scoreboard's not done. The incentive plan is not done. But these guys are already, I was reviewing with them earlier today. They had 3 branches, the initial 15 member interviews. So typically we say, if you're not seeing the needle move, let me answer the question different ways. 3 to 4 weeks to do the diagnostic stuff, nail down winning. Another 2 to 3 weeks, scoreboard, incentive plan nailed. So you're comfortably 2 months. Now you're driving results. If you don't see noticeable improvement in results by the next 1, 2, tops 3 months, something's wrong. We got to get into it. Something's wrong. And again, of course, we have more than a casual vested interest in this because that's how our comp goes. So it can be pretty quick, and we're learning. That's why I told you about the credit union. These guys, we used to say, yeah, we'll get after that after we define scoreboard and incentive plan. They blew right past that. They're already starting to move the needle, and we don't even have the scoreboard incentive plan done. So suffice it to say, 2 months to get it started. In the next 2 months, you ought to be seeing results. And get in touch with me in another month or 2. I may have a faster answer to that.
Okay, great. Right. And with compensation tied to the results, I'm sure that helps move the needle quite significantly.
Well, and frankly, that's right, because the other thing that's true, only selectively, 4 companies we've actually, we've had performance comp with everybody, but there are 4 companies that we've actually made equity investments in, which is kind of a longer term kind of commitment. And we feel great about that from a variety of different standpoints. But I guess what I would say is, if you're a professional service firm and you're supposed to be helping your clients be more successful, why would you not have your compensation tied to their results? I mean, I don't get it. So it just seems very natural to us.
Yeah. Yep. So changing gears a little bit, you mentioned, I think it was John Case as someone who writes on the topic, but what are your thoughts? How similar is this concept to the great game of business?
I think there's certainly some similarities, and I basically developed great game coaching. I spent 19 years with great game of business. So I would say there's a lot of similarities. The thing I would say, though, is the incorporation of Fred Reicheld's stuff and the customer things is, I'll call it a good enhancement So suffice to say, I think we've built on those things. But I'm a huge Jack Stack fan, and think very highly of everybody at Great Game of Business. I would just say there's sort of a reason that we found some elements can be further enhanced, and that's frankly why we developed open book coaching.
Great. All right. Well, one last question is, what are some of the common mistakes that should be avoided in this whole implementation and thinking about this? What have you learned in your 400 engagements?
Yeah, and continuing to learn, by the way. The comment I would make would be this. Probably the most classic is, oh, I want to develop an incentive plan. And the whole notion of thinking, getting people's input, and thinking about what, and there's it's an incentive plan, and it's going to be profit sharing. Whether profits is even the issue, or whether people understand profits or not. It's well intended, but it's a mistake on a few different levels. One, it may not define winning. Number two is, if the folks don't understand it, it's not an incentive plan. You can't be an incentive plan if they don't understand what it is. And the notion of getting people involved in figuring out, if the real goal is to engage their hearts and minds, you want to do that right off the bat, rather than present it as some sort of program. So that, I think, is probably the most common mistake. The other thing, though, is the idea of, I do it in what's really beneficial, the whole idea of ongoing forecasting and learning. Hugely important. And in contrast, I'll speak in again this April at the National Center for Employee Ownership, another great forum. Love the guys there. I've seen folks say, we want to get our employees to think and act like owners, so we'll make them owners. And so they do an ESOP. But the employees aren't any more involved in the company than they were the day before. And I remember I was in Detroit with a particular individual, did an ESOP, and he was really complaining. He said, I brought in this particular manager, and I was talking to him about the value of the ESOP shares that are now his. And he responded, yeah, that's really great. How about those Tigers this year? I think they're going to be great. He couldn't care less. And it wasn't that he was a bad person. But giving people equity and becoming an owner are two radically different things. So it's the notion that you're going to get people to think and act like owners. That's great. That's why you noted in the examples that I provided, ownership kind of questions. Think for many of our guests will be managers or owners of business. Think about the challenges, the questions that you're faced with. Those are the kind of questions that you want to pose to your employees. You want to get them to think and act like owners? Have them help you think and act or address the questions you're faced with. You're an owner. And I think the likelihood that you'll be moving in a good direction, very high.
Yeah, so that's the key. Economic engagement isn't providing them with incentives or bonuses, but really involving them in the process and therefore the solution.
It's really so. A quick note. They're public about it, so I can be equally public. KKR purchased a big private equity company. KKR purchased a company called Gardner Denver, and they wanted to really instill an ownership culture. And so they gave every employee $4,000 of Gardner Denver stock. And when Steve was telling me this, I said, that is such a nice bad idea. And he said, what do you mean? I said, it's really nice. I'm sure nobody turned the money down. but it's such a bad idea. How much equity did they give you? I said, Steve, is Pete Stavros is the gentleman's name. You know, you earn equity. You actually stepped back in terms of your ownership culture by doing that, even though it was really well intended. And he responded by saying, yeah, that's kind of what we concluded. So yeah, that's right. You earn equity, you learn the economics. That's really how ownership evolves.
Fascinating, and I'm sure we could talk for a whole other webinar, as you said, but we will save that for another day. So I want to thank you for your time today and remind our attendees that our next webinar is coming up on Friday, March 8th at 10 a.m. Pacific. And the topic of that is debunking the millennial mystery, how to retain and engage your millennial workforce. So as talent is one of our top topics and workforce expansion is high, this will definitely help consider that critical segment of people that you might hire. So you can register for that session at vistage.com/FWV. That's FWV as in Fridays with Vistage. So thank you, Bill, and thank you to all of our attendees today, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.